The moment I stepped onto that white marble foyer, I knew I was about to make either the smartest decision of my life or the most catastrophic mistake I could ever imagine. My fiancé's mother, Victoria Hartwell, looked at me like I was something unpleasant she'd found stuck to the bottom of her designer heel. Her eyes swept over my simple black dress from Target, my drugstore mascara, my sensible flats, and I watched her mentally calculate my net worth and find me worthless. She leaned toward her son, my fiancé Daniel, and whispered something she thought I couldn't hear, but I heard every word. She said I looked like the catering staff who'd wandered in through the wrong entrance. And right then, I knew this dinner was going to be very, very interesting. My name is Maya Chen. I'm 29 years old, and I have a confession to make. For the past 11 months, I've been hiding a secret from the man I was supposed to marry. It's not a small secret like pretending I finished the leftover Chinese food when really I gave it to my neighbor's dog. It's not an embarrassing secret like the fact that I still sleep with the stuffed rabbit my grandmother gave me when I was 6. No. My secret is that I make $52,000 a month. After taxes, it's still the kind of number that makes accountants double-check their spreadsheets. I'm the founder and CEO of a healthcare technology startup that got acquired last year for a figure I'm still not entirely comfortable saying out loud. I have equity in 3 other companies. I sit on 2 nonprofit boards. I was on the cover of a regional business magazine last spring, and Daniel thought I was a struggling medical billing specialist who could barely afford her studio apartment. I never actually lied to him. When we met at a coffee shop 14 months ago, he asked what I did for work, and I said I worked in healthcare. He nodded like he understood, and then asked if I was a nurse. I smiled and said something vague about being more on the administrative side. He filled in the blanks himself, and I never corrected him. Why would I do something like that? Why would I let the man I was dating, the man I was falling in love with, believe I was barely scraping by when I could have bought his condo building 3 times over? Because my grandmother taught me something a long time ago that changed the way I see the world. My grandmother raised me after my parents divorced when I was 8. My mother moved to Europe with her new husband, and my father was too busy building his career to remember he had a daughter. Grandma Lynn took me in without hesitation. She lived in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood in Oakland. She drove an old Honda, shopped at regular grocery stores, and never wore anything flashy. She taught me to cook simple meals, to appreciate small joys, and to never measure my worth by my bank account. What I didn't know until she passed away when I was 24 was that my grandmother was worth over $8 million. She'd built a chain of dry cleaning businesses in her 30s, invested wisely, and chose to live simply because she believed character mattered more than appearances. She left everything to me, along with a letter I still keep in my nightstand drawer. In that letter, she wrote something I've never forgotten. She said the true character of a person only shows when they think no one important is watching, when they believe you have nothing to offer them, when they think you're beneath their level of attention. That's when you see who they really are. So when Daniel invited me to dinner at his family's estate in Austin, when he hinted that this might be the night things got serious, when he mentioned that his mother was very particular about first impressions, I made a decision. I would give the Hartwell family the test my grandmother taught me. I would show up as the simple, modest woman they expected. I would dress plainly, drive my old car, and speak humbly about my circumstances. And I would watch. I would watch how they treated someone they believed couldn't help them, someone they thought was beneath them, someone they assumed had nothing to offer. And before you judge me, before you think I was being manipulative or deceptive, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what your partner's family really thinks of you? Have you ever had that nagging feeling that the smiles are fake and the compliments are hollow? Have you ever wanted to know the truth, even if it might hurt? I wanted to know. I needed to know. Because I wasn't just considering marrying Daniel, I was considering marrying into his family. And families, as my grandmother also taught me, are forever. Now, before I continue with this story, I just want to take a quick moment. If you're enjoying this so far, would you mind hitting that like button and leaving a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there? I love reading those comments, seeing people from all over the world tuning in at all hours. It means more to me than you know. Okay, back to the story. The Hartwell estate was exactly what I expected and somehow still managed to overwhelm me with its excess. The driveway alone was longer than some streets I'd lived on. The gates were wrought iron with gold detailing, because apparently regular iron wasn't pretentious enough. The lawn was manicured with such precision that it suggested someone had measured each blade of grass with a ruler. As I drove my 8-year-old Toyota Camry up that pristine driveway, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Minimal makeup, hair pulled back in a low ponytail, my grandmother's small jade pendant around my neck, the only jewelry I wore. I looked exactly like someone who didn't belong here. Perfect. Daniel met me at the door with a kiss that felt slightly performative, like he was doing it for an audience. His eyes flicked to my dress, my shoes, my lack of accessories, and I saw something in his expression I'd never noticed before. Embarrassment. He was embarrassed by how I looked. I filed that observation away for later. Inside, the house was a monument to new money, desperately trying to look like old money. Crystal chandeliers hung from every ceiling. Oil paintings in gilded frames covered the walls, though I noticed they were prints, not originals. The furniture was expensive but uncomfortable looking, chosen for appearance rather than function. And there, standing in the foyer like a queen surveying her kingdom, was Victoria Hartwell. She was in her early 60s, her face clearly the work of several excellent surgeons. Her blonde hair was styled in a perfect helmet that probably required industrial-strength hairspray to maintain. Her dress was designer, her jewelry was real, and her smile was absolutely fake. She extended her hand to me like she was granting me an audience. I shook it and felt the limpness, the detachment, the complete lack of warmth. Then she made that comment to Daniel, the one about me looking like the help, and I smiled and pretended I hadn't heard a thing. The evening was about to get really interesting. If I'd known what I was walking into that night, I might have worn armor instead of a simple black dress. But then again, I've always believed the best armor is information, and I'd done my research. The Hartwell family owned a chain of upscale steakhouse restaurants across Texas and Oklahoma. Daniel's father, Richard, had inherited the business from his own father and spent the last 30 years expanding it. Victoria had married into the family at 24 and immediately began climbing the social ladder with the determination of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted. They had 2 children. Daniel, my fiancé, was 31 and worked as a brand consultant for a firm that had nothing to do with the family business. Apparently, this was a sore point for Richard, who'd expected his son to take over the restaurants. And then there was Melissa, the older sister, who was 35 and treated the family fortune like her personal piggy bank. I found all of this through public records, social media, and some well-placed Google searches. I'd seen photos of lavish parties, society events, and charity galas. I'd read articles about Victoria's philanthropy, though closer examination revealed that most of her donations came with significant tax benefits and publicity opportunities. None of this prepared me for meeting Melissa in person. She arrived 20 minutes late, which I'd later learn was her signature move. Making an entrance was more important than respecting other people's time. She swept into the living room in a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, diamonds dripping from her ears and neck like she'd fallen into a jewelry store and come out covered in merchandise. Her greeting to me was a single word delivered with the warmth of a frozen fish. Hi. Not hello, nice to meet you. Not hi, Daniel's told us so much about you. Just hi, with a slight curl of the lip that suggested she'd smelled something unpleasant. I smiled and said hi back. She turned to her mother and launched into a conversation that deliberately excluded me, discussing some charity event and whether the florist had been fired yet for last month's debacle. I stood there holding my glass of water, feeling about as welcome as a vegetarian at a steakhouse. Daniel hovered nearby, looking uncomfortable but saying nothing. This was the second observation I filed away. Richard Hartwell was a different creature entirely. He was a large man, the kind who'd probably been athletic in his youth but had since surrendered to the comforts of wealth. He shook my hand with a grip that was meant to be impressive but just felt tired. But his eyes were shrewd, and I noticed him watching me with something that might have been curiosity. There was another guest at this dinner, someone I hadn't expected. An older gentleman named Thomas Wright, introduced as a longtime family friend and business associate. He was in his late 60s with silver hair and a piercing gaze that seemed to miss nothing. When he shook my hand, his eyes lingered on my face with a flicker of recognition that confused me. Did I know him? Had we met somewhere before? I couldn't place him. and he said nothing, but throughout the evening, I caught him watching me with that same puzzled expression. Victoria led us to the dining room, which was decorated as if someone had been given an unlimited budget and zero taste. The table was long enough to seat a royal banquet. The chairs were upholstered in what I assumed was genuine silk, and the silverware included more forks than I'd ever seen outside a restaurant supply store. I counted them. 6 forks at each setting. 6 for a single meal. I've seen surgeries performed with fewer instruments. Victoria noticed me looking at the silverware and smiled that frozen smile of hers. She said she supposed I wasn't used to formal dinners, her voice dripping with false sympathy. I told her my grandmother always taught me it's not the forks that matter, but the company you share the meal with. Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Melissa snorted into her wine glass. Dinner began. The first course was some kind of soup I couldn't identify, but that probably cost more per bowl than my weekly grocery budget. Victoria used this time to begin what I would later consider the interrogation. She asked where I grew up. I said a small town outside Oakland, which was true. She asked about my family. I said my grandmother raised me, which was also true. She asked what my parents did. I said they weren't really in the picture. Victoria made a sound that was supposed to be sympathetic, but came out like someone unclogging a drain. She said how difficult it must have been, growing up without proper guidance. I said my grandmother provided all the guidance I needed. Melissa leaned forward, her diamonds catching the light from the chandelier overhead. She asked what my grandmother did for a living. I said she was a businesswoman. Melissa's eyebrows rose slightly. She asked what kind of business. I said small businesses. Nothing too exciting. The truth, of course, was that my grandmother had built an empire she eventually sold for several $1,000,000, but that wasn't the kind of truth that would serve my purpose tonight. Victoria moved on to the next topic. She asked about my current job. I said I worked in healthcare. She asked if I was a nurse. I said my role was more administrative. Victoria nodded knowingly, as if this confirmed everything she'd already decided about me. She said that was nice, that every hospital needed administrative support. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair but still said nothing. And that's when Melissa decided to bring up Jennifer. Jennifer. The name dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water, sending ripples across the table. Melissa mentioned the name so casually, like she was discussing the weather or the quality of the soup. She said she'd run into Jennifer last week, that Jennifer was doing so well, that her family's investment firm was thriving. I watched Daniel's face carefully. Something flickered there, hidden quickly. Guilt, nervousness, I couldn't quite identify it before it vanished. Victoria picked up the thread with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting for this opportunity. She said Jennifer had always been such a lovely girl, so accomplished, so well-suited to their family's lifestyle. She'd been Daniel's girlfriend for 4 years? Did I know that? I said I didn't. Victoria smiled. She said it was such a shame when they broke up. Everyone expected them to end up together. Jennifer's family owned a major investment firm that would have been a perfect match for the Hartwell restaurant empire. The implication was clear. Jennifer had been the right choice. I was not. I glanced around the dining room and noticed for the first time that there were photos on the wall behind me. I turned slightly in my chair and saw a gallery of family moments, Christmases, birthdays, graduations, and in at least 3 of those photos, a beautiful woman with auburn hair stood next to Daniel, her arm linked through his, her smile radiant. Jennifer. Victoria followed my gaze and said nothing, but her satisfaction was almost palpable. Melissa twisted the knife a little deeper. She said Jennifer was still single. Quite surprising, actually, that no one had snatched her up yet. Almost like she was waiting for something, or someone. I turned back to the table and smiled. I said she sounded like an extraordinary woman. This was clearly not the response Melissa expected. She blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Victoria recovered first. She said yes, Jennifer was extraordinary. And then, with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, she added that she hoped I didn't feel too out of place in their world, given my more modest background. I asked what she meant by modest. Victoria's smile grew teeth. She said she understood that not everyone was born with certain advantages, that some people had to work ordinary jobs and live ordinary lives, that there was no shame in being common. Common. She'd called me common. I felt something shift inside me, but I kept my expression neutral. I'd come here tonight to learn the truth about these people, and the truth was becoming clearer by the minute. Daniel finally spoke. He said his mother didn't mean anything by that she was just being protective. Victoria patted his hand and said, of course she was protective, that a mother always wanted the best for her son. The unspoken conclusion hung in the air like smoke. And you're not the best. Richard cleared his throat and tried to change the subject. He asked about my hobbies, whether I had any interests outside of work. I said I enjoyed reading, hiking, cooking, simple meals, nothing fancy. Melissa laughed and said that was adorable, like a child listing their favorite activities. Thomas, the family friend, spoke for the first time since we'd sat down. He said he thought there was something to be said for simple pleasures, that his own grandmother had lived a modest life and had been the happiest person he'd ever known. Victoria shot him a look that could have curdled milk. Thomas ignored her and continued looking at me with that strange, searching expression. He asked what my grandmother's name was. I said Lin Chen. Thomas's eyebrows rose slightly, but he said nothing more, just nodded thoughtfully and turned his attention back to his soup. The rest of dinner continued in the same vein. Victoria and Melissa took turns asking questions designed to remind me of my place, which in their minds was somewhere far beneath them. Daniel made weak attempts to defend me, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. Richard remained mostly silent, watching what was happening with the tired resignation of a man who'd learned long ago that arguing with his wife was pointless. And throughout it all, Thomas watched me. By the time dessert arrived, I'd learned everything I needed to know about the Hartwell family. They were snobs of the highest order, the kind who measured human worth in dollars and social connections. They saw me as an obstacle to be removed, a problem to be solved, a mistake Daniel had made that needed correcting. But I'd also learned something else, something I hadn't expected. Daniel wasn't the man I thought he was. The Daniel I'd fallen for was kind and attentive and seemed genuinely interested in me as a person. But this Daniel, the one sitting at his mother's table and letting her tear me apart without a word of real protest, was someone different, someone weaker, someone who cared more about his family's approval than standing up for the woman he claimed to love. I wondered which Daniel was real. I was about to find out. After dessert, Victoria announced we'd be having coffee in the living room. The men drifted toward the windows to discuss business, while Melissa excused herself to make a phone call. Victoria said she needed to speak with the housekeeper about something and would join us in a moment. This left me alone with my thoughts and a perfect opportunity. I excused myself to find the restroom. Daniel pointed me toward the back of the house, down a long hallway lined with more pretentious artwork. I walked slowly, taking note of the details. The house was impressive from a purely financial standpoint, but it felt cold, empty, like a museum where nobody actually lived. The bathroom was easy enough to find, but I wasn't really looking for it. What I was looking for was information, understanding, some clue that would help me make sense of the evening. I found something much better. As I passed a partially open door, I heard voices, Victoria's voice and Melissa's. I stopped. Every instinct told me to keep walking, to respect their privacy, to not eavesdrop like a character in a soap opera. But something in Victoria's tone made me freeze, something sharp, urgent. I moved closer to the door, staying in the shadows. Victoria was saying they needed to handle this situation quickly. She said they couldn't let Daniel make this mistake. Melissa agreed. She said she couldn't believe he'd brought her here, that she'd thought this was just a phase, like his CrossFit obsession last year. Victoria said this was more serious than exercise. This woman could ruin everything. I felt my heart beating faster. They were talking about me. Of course they were talking about me. But what came next was what truly chilled my blood. Melissa said the timing couldn't be worse. She said they needed the partnership with Jennifer's family to go through, and Daniel needed to be with Jennifer for that to happen. The investment firm. Jennifer's family's company. Victoria agreed. She said the restaurants were struggling. They needed the Henderson family's investment to survive the next fiscal year. I felt the floor shift beneath me. The Hartwell restaurants were in financial trouble. I'd suspected something from my research, but this confirmed it. Melissa continued. She said Daniel was supposed to keep Jennifer interested while they worked out the details. That was the plan. Jennifer's family would invest in the restaurants, and in exchange, they'd get access to the Hartwell distribution network and real estate holdings. Victoria said Daniel had assured her he was keeping his options open with Jennifer. Keeping his options open, while proposing to me. I leaned against the wall, my mind racing. This wasn't about simple snobbery. This wasn't just a family who didn't like their son's girlfriend. This was calculated, strategic. Daniel wasn't just a weak man who couldn't stand up to his mother. Daniel was using me. But for what? Why keep me around if Jennifer was always the plan? Melissa answered my unspoken question. She said Daniel was an idiot. He actually seemed to like this little healthcare worker, this nobody. He was supposed to use her as a placeholder until the Jennifer deal was finalized, but he was getting attached. A placeholder. That's what I was. A distraction. A stand-in. Someone to keep Daniel occupied while the family sorted out their business arrangements. Victoria said they would handle it. She said they'd make the engagement announcement tonight, publicly commit Daniel to this girl, and then find a way to break them up before the wedding. Once they had Jennifer secured, they'd discover some terrible secret about me that would justify ending the engagement. Melissa asked what terrible secret. Victoria said they'd invent one if they had to. I stood frozen in that hallway, listening to two women plan the destruction of my relationship like they were planning a dinner party. And then, Melissa said something that made everything worse. She said at least the girl was too stupid to suspect anything. She said Daniel had chosen well in that regard. She said I was naive, trusting, probably just grateful that someone like Daniel had noticed me. Victoria laughed and agreed. I stepped back from the door and walked silently down the hallway. My hands were shaking, but not from pain, from anger. They thought I was stupid. They thought I was naive. They thought I was so desperate for love that I'd accept whatever crumbs they threw me. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I found the bathroom, splashed some cold water on my face, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me wasn't broken. She wasn't devastated. She was thinking, I'd come here tonight to test Daniel's family, and they had failed spectacularly. But the test had revealed something I hadn't expected. Daniel himself was part of the problem. He wasn't simply caught between his family and me. He was actively deceiving me. The question now was what to do about it. I could confront him. I could walk out right now and tell everyone exactly what I'd heard. I could cause a scene, expose their plans, and leave this house forever. But that would be too easy, too quick. They'd label me as emotional, dramatic, bitter. They'd tell themselves I was just proving everything they thought about me. No. If I was going to respond to this betrayal, I would do it my way, on my terms, with a plan they would never see coming. My grandmother had taught me many things, but there was one lesson that superseded all others. She said when someone underestimates you, they've given you a gift, the gift of surprise. Victoria and Melissa had just given me the greatest gift of all. They had no idea what I was capable of. I fixed my makeup, smoothed my hair, and walked back to the living room with a smile on my face. The game was just beginning. When I returned to the living room, something had changed. The furniture had been slightly rearranged, the lighting adjusted. Victoria was standing by the fireplace with a look of barely concealed anticipation. Richard had positioned himself near the door, looking uncomfortable. Melissa was pretending to examine a painting, but I caught her watching Daniel with a knowing smirk. And Daniel was standing in the center of the room, looking nervous, too nervous. He turned when I entered, and his face lit up with what was supposed to be a loving smile. He walked toward me, took my hands in his, and said he wanted to ask me something. I felt the trap closing around me. Daniel said he knew we hadn't been together that long. He said his family could be a bit overwhelming at first, but he said he knew what he wanted. He said he wanted me, and then he got down on one knee. The ring he pulled out was big and flashy, exactly the kind of thing Victoria would approve of. I also noticed immediately that its quality was questionable. The diamond was cloudy, the setting uneven. It was the kind of ring that looked impressive in low light, but revealed its flaws in the harsh light of day, just like the man holding it. Daniel asked me to marry him. Behind him, Victoria was beaming. This was clearly the plan, the first step in their strategy. Get Daniel publicly engaged to me, then find a way to get rid of me later. In the meantime, they'd use the engagement to string Jennifer along, making her wait on the promise of Daniel while they sorted out their business arrangements. I understood all of this in an instant. I also understood that I had a choice to make. I could say no. I could reject this proposal from a man who was using me, in front of a family that despised me. I could walk out with my dignity intact and never see any of them again. But that would end the story too soon. I thought about what I'd heard in that hallway. I thought about their plans to invent some scandal about me. I thought about how they saw me as stupid, naive, disposable, and I thought about how satisfying it would be to show them exactly how wrong they were. So I said yes. Daniel slipped the ring on my finger and Victoria started clapping like she was at a theater performance. Melissa offered her congratulations with all the warmth of a January morning in Minnesota. Richard shook Daniel's hand and told him he'd done well. Thomas caught my eye from across the room. There was something in his expression, something knowing, like he suspected this story had a few more chapters left. I smiled at him, and he smiled back. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of champagne and false congratulations. Victoria talked about planning the engagement party. Melissa discussed venues. Richard mentioned business opportunities that might come from the union of our families, though he stumbled over this, clearly unsure what my family could possibly bring. Daniel stayed close to me, playing the part of the devoted fiancé with surprising conviction. If I hadn't heard what his mother and sister said, I might have believed him. But I had heard, and I would never forget. When the evening finally ended, Daniel walked me to my car. The night air was cold and clear, and for a moment we stood there in the driveway looking at each other. He asked if I was okay. He said he knew his family could be a lot, but he promised they'd warm up to me in time. I said I understood. I said I was just tired. He kissed me goodnight and I drove away from the Hartwell estate with his ring on my finger and a plan forming in my mind. The next morning, I began my research. If there's one thing my career has taught me, it's the power of information, of data, of documentation. I spend my days analyzing systems, finding weaknesses, optimizing solutions. I was about to apply those same skills to the Hartwell family. And what I discovered in the following weeks confirmed everything I'd heard and more. The Hartwell restaurants were indeed in financial trouble. Not just struggling, but serious structural problems. They'd expanded too fast during boom years, taken on too much debt, and now the bills were coming due. Their main supply contracts were up for renewal, and suppliers were considering other options. The partnership with Jennifer's family wasn't just strategic, it was desperate. But that wasn't all. As I dug deeper, I found something else. Something the Hartwells probably thought was buried forever. Melissa had been embezzling from the family business, small amounts at first, hidden in expense reports and petty cash accounts, but over the years it had added up. Hundreds of thousands of dollars siphoned off to fund her lifestyle while the business struggled. I documented everything I found: financial statements, transaction records, legal filings, and then I started making phone calls. My grandmother's name still carried weight in certain circles. The business contacts she'd cultivated over decades remembered the Chen family with respect. When I reached out to them, they were happy to talk. One of those contacts knew Thomas Wright, and it turned out Thomas had his own history with the Hartwell family. They'd cheated him in a business deal years ago. Nothing illegal, just unethical enough to leave a bitter taste. He'd been waiting for an opportunity to even the score. I was about to give him that opportunity. The following weeks were an exercise in patience and performance. I played the part of the happy fiancé with the skill of an award-winning actress. I attended family dinners at the Hartwell estate. I endured Victoria's passive-aggressive comments with a smile. I watched Melissa flaunt her designer clothes and expensive jewelry, knowing exactly where the money had come from. And I watched Daniel. He was different now. Or maybe I was just seeing him clearly for the first time. The attention that once seemed charming now felt calculated. The compliments felt rehearsed. And his phone, which he guarded with increasing vigilance, buzzed with messages he quickly hid from view. I knew who was texting him. I'd seen that name flash across his screen more than once. Jennifer. One evening, I told Daniel I'd be working late. Instead, I parked near the restaurant where he was supposed to be meeting a client. He wasn't meeting any client. He was meeting her. I watched them through the window as they sat together at a corner table, their heads close together, their body language unmistakably intimate. At one point, he took her hand across the table. At another, she laughed at something he said and touched his face. I took photographs, not because I needed evidence for any legal purpose, but because I wanted to remember this moment. I wanted to remember exactly who Daniel Hartwell really was. He wasn't just weak. He wasn't just a mama's boy. He was a liar and a cheater, actively maintaining 2 relationships while his family orchestrated the outcome behind the scenes. The rage I felt in that moment was hot and purifying, but I didn't act on it. Not yet. Instead, I went home and added the photographs to my growing file. Thomas and I met regularly, always in secret. He had his own documentation of the Hartwells' questionable business practices. He knew people who'd been hurt by their dealings over the years. He was more than willing to help bring them down. But he asked me why. He said he understood his own motivations, but he wanted to know mine. Was it just about revenge, or was it something more? I thought about his question for a long time before answering. I said it wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. I said the Hartwells had spent their lives using their money and position to manipulate people. They treated anyone they considered beneath them as disposable. They were raising Daniel to be the same way, and they would keep doing this to others long after I was gone. I said someone needed to show them that their money couldn't protect them from consequences. Thomas nodded slowly. He said my grandmother would be proud. That was the moment I knew I'd made the right decision. The engagement party was scheduled for 3 weeks later. The Hartwells held it at their estate, inviting everyone who mattered in the business community. Victoria was treating it like a coronation, an opportunity to show off her perfect family to the world. She had no idea what was coming. I spent those 3 weeks preparing. I coordinated with Thomas. I made strategic calls to industry contacts. I even reached out to a reporter who covered business news for the local paper. They were very interested in what I had to share. And then the night before the party, I did one last thing. I gave Daniel one final chance to be honest. We were sitting in his apartment, going over last-minute details for the party. I asked him casually how he felt about us, about our future. He said he was excited. He said he couldn't wait to marry me. I asked if there was anything he wanted to tell me. Anything at all. He looked at me with those blue eyes that once seemed so charming. He said there was nothing. He said I was everything he'd ever wanted. I asked about Jennifer. His face went pale. He recovered quickly, but I saw the flash of fear in his eyes. He said Jennifer was just an old friend. Nothing more. I nodded and said I understood. And in that moment, I did understand. I understood that Daniel would never tell me the truth. He would lie to my face as long as it served his purposes. He was his mother's son through and through. The following evening, I put on a dress from my real wardrobe. Not the modest black dress I'd worn to that first dinner. This one was designer, elegant, worth more than everything Victoria owned combined. I looked at myself in the mirror and smiled. It was time to show the Hartwell family exactly who they'd underestimated. The Hartwell estate had been transformed for the engagement party. White tents dotted the manicured lawn. Crystal chandeliers hung from temporary structures, casting prismatic light across the assembled crowd. A string quartet played tasteful classical music near the fountain. Waiters in crisp uniforms circulated with champagne and appetizers that probably cost more per bite than some people's hourly wage. Victoria had outdone herself. This wasn't just a party. This was a statement. I paused in my usual Toyota, watching the expressions of the valet attendants as they tried to reconcile my modest vehicle with the parade of Mercedes and BMWs that had preceded me. One of them actually asked if I was with the catering company. I smiled and handed him my keys. The walk from the parking area to the main tent felt like a runway. With each step, I was shedding the persona I'd worn for the past 3 weeks. The nervous fiancé, the grateful girlfriend, the simple woman who should be thankful for the Hartwell's grudging acceptance. Tonight, I was Maya Chen, the real one. My dress was a deep emerald green, custom-made by a designer whose name was whispered with reverence in fashion circles. My jewelry was understated but unmistakable to anyone who knew quality. My grandmother's jade pendant hung at my throat, a piece that had been appraised at more than most cars cost. My watch was a limited edition that only 50 people in the world owned. I'd spent the last 11 months hiding who I was. Tonight, I stopped hiding. The first person to notice me was a woman I didn't recognize, someone's wife or girlfriend standing near the entrance to the main tent. She looked at me, looked twice, then whispered something to her companion. They both stared. I kept walking. The second person to notice was Richard Hartwell. He was greeting guests near the bar, performing his host duties with the tired enthusiasm of a man who would rather be watching golf. When he saw me, his welcoming smile froze in place. His eyes traveled from my face to my dress to my jewelry and back again, and I watched confusion replace his practiced hospitality. I said good evening and thanked him for hosting such a lovely party. He stammered something about being glad I could make it, his eyes still trying to solve the puzzle I presented. I moved on before he could ask any questions. The main tent was packed with perhaps 100 guests, a carefully curated collection of business partners, society figures, and family friends. I recognized some faces from my research. There by the champagne fountain stood the regional director for a major restaurant supply company. There was the owner of a competing steakhouse chain. There was a journalist from the local business publication. And there, presiding over the gathering, was Victoria Hartwell. She was wearing a cream-colored dress that had probably cost a small fortune, though it was clearly off the rack despite her best efforts to suggest otherwise. Her jewelry was impressive by normal standards, but unremarkable by the standards of true wealth. She was laughing at something one of her guests had said, her head thrown back in that practiced way that suggested she'd learned to fake amusement in finishing school. She hadn't seen me yet. I collected a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and made my way through the crowd, stopping to introduce myself to various guests along the way. Each interaction followed the same pattern. Confusion at my appearance, surprise when I mentioned I was Daniel's fiancé, renewed confusion when my dress, my jewelry, my demeanor didn't match what they'd been told about me. The word was spreading. I could see it in the whispers, in the sideways glances, in the phones people were subtly checking as they tried to figure out who I actually was. Good. I finally reached Victoria's circle just as she was finishing a story about her recent charity work. She turned to greet the newcomer with her usual frozen smile. And then her face underwent a remarkable transformation. First confusion, then recognition, then disbelief, then something that might have been fear. She said my name like a question. I said good evening, Victoria, and thanked her for hosting such a beautiful party. Her eyes were moving rapidly, taking in every detail of my appearance. The dress that cost more than her monthly household budget, the pendant that had been featured in a jewelry magazine, the watch she'd probably never seen outside of an advertisement. She asked where I'd gotten those things, her voice carefully controlled but unable to hide the tremor beneath. I said they were just a few pieces I'd been saving for a special occasion. Melissa appeared at her mother's side, summoned by some invisible distress signal. She looked at me, and her expression went through the same journey Victoria's had. Confusion, recognition, disbelief. But Melissa recovered faster. She said my dress was interesting. She asked if it was a rental. I told her the designer's name. I said he was a friend who'd made it specifically for me. The designer's name hit Melissa like a physical blow. This was someone who dressed celebrities, who had a years-long waiting list, who didn't make dresses for medical billing specialists who could barely afford their rent. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. I excused myself to go find Daniel. As I walked away, I heard Victoria whisper something to Melissa about finding out what was going on. I heard Melissa's confused response, that she had no idea, that this made no sense. I smiled to myself and kept walking. The first phase of the evening was complete. The seed of doubt had been planted. Now it was time to let it grow. Daniel found me before I found him. He emerged from a cluster of guests near the bar, his face pale, his eyes wide. He'd clearly heard the whispers, seen the looks, tried to reconcile the woman standing before him with the woman he thought he knew. He asked what was going on. He asked where I'd gotten the dress, the jewelry, the transformation. He asked why I looked like a completely different person. I said I looked like myself. He stared at me and I saw something shift behind his eyes. Not understanding exactly, more like the first crack in a wall that had been hiding an uncomfortable truth. He asked if we could talk privately. I said later. I said, after all, this was our engagement party. We had guests to attend to. Before he could protest, I took his arm and steered him toward a group of business associates. These were the men and women who ran the restaurant industry in our region. the people whose opinions actually mattered for the Hartwell business's survival. They'd been watching my entrance with undisguised curiosity. This time, I introduced myself properly. I gave my full name, Maya Chen, and mentioned my company. I watched their expressions change as they recognized the name and realized who I actually was. One of them, a silver-haired man who ran a competing restaurant chain, said he'd heard of me. He said his nephew worked in tech and had mentioned my name in connection with some innovative healthcare solutions. I said that was very kind of him. Another guest, a woman who handled mergers and acquisitions for a major investment firm, asked if I was related to Lin Chen. I said she was my grandmother. The woman's eyebrows rose. She said my grandmother had been a remarkable businesswoman. She said the Chen name still carried significant weight in certain financial circles. I could feel Daniel tensing beside me. He had no idea what any of this meant. He'd never asked about my family beyond the most superficial questions. He'd assumed poor meant unimportant and had never bothered to look any deeper. His mistake. The evening continued, and with each conversation, the truth spread further. People talked, checked their phones, confirmed details. The narrative was shifting under the Hartwells' feet, and they didn't know how to stop it. Thomas arrived about an hour into the party. He found me near the rose garden, momentarily alone while Daniel was pulled aside by his father for an urgent conversation. Thomas said the supply company representative was here. He said the man had been very interested in the documentation Thomas had shared with him earlier that week. I asked if he was ready. Thomas said he'd been ready for years. We talked for a few minutes more, finalizing the details of what would happen next. Then Thomas disappeared back into the crowd, and I resumed my role as the happy fiancé. Victoria found me afterward. She'd regained some of her composure, though I could see the strain in her eyes. She pulled me aside with a grip that was firmer than necessary and demanded to know what I was doing. I asked what she meant. She said I knew exactly what she meant. She said the dress, the jewelry, the stories I was telling people about my grandmother and my work. She said she wanted to know what my game was. I said there was no game. I said I was simply being myself. She said that was impossible. She said Daniel had told her about my circumstances. She said I was a billing specialist who lived in a studio apartment and drove a car that belonged in a junkyard. I said Daniel had made certain assumptions. I said I'd never actually told him those things. Victoria's face went very still. I said I worked in healthcare, which was true. I said my role was administrative, which was also true since CEOs handle administration. I said I'd never claimed to be poor. I said I simply never corrected his assumptions. She asked why. I looked at her directly. I said my grandmother taught me that the true character of a person only shows when they think no one important is watching. I said I wanted to know who the Hartwell family really was. Victoria's face lost its color. I said now I knew. Before she could respond, the string quartet stopped playing. Richard Hartwell's voice came over the speaker system, announcing that it was time for official toasts and speeches. Victoria looked at me with something that might have been fear. I smiled and walked toward the stage. The main event was about to begin. The stage had been set up at the far end of the main tent, decorated with flowers and soft lighting that was probably meant to be romantic but instead felt like a spotlight waiting for its moment. Richard stood at the microphone, welcoming guests and thanking them for coming to celebrate this special occasion. He talked about family, about tradition, about the importance of strong alliances in both business and life. His eyes kept flicking to Victoria, who was making her way through the crowd toward the stage with the determination of a general approaching a battlefield. She reached the microphone just as Richard was finishing his remarks. She took over smoothly, her composure firmly restored, her smile as frozen and perfect as ever. She said she was so pleased to welcome everyone to this celebration of her son's engagement. She said Daniel had found a wonderful young woman, someone who would make a perfect addition to the Hartwell family. She said they had exciting plans for the future, plans that would ensure the Hartwell legacy continued for generations to come. Then she began hinting at business opportunities. She talked about growth and expansion. She talked about new partnerships and strategic alliances. She talked about the Hartwell restaurants entering an exciting new chapter. I watched the supply company representative shift uncomfortably. I saw Thomas catch his eye and nod almost imperceptibly. Victoria was building towards something. She was using this engagement party as a platform for some kind of business announcement, probably related to the Henderson merger that was supposed to save her company. She called Daniel to the stage. He climbed the steps looking nervous, though trying to hide it behind his practiced smile. He stood beside his mother and looked out at the crowd, searching for me. His expression was complicated. Victoria said there was one more person who should be on this stage. She said she wanted to welcome her future daughter-in-law, the woman who had captured her son's heart. She said my name, and the crowd turned to look at me. I set down my champagne glass and walked toward the stage. The tent was silent, except for my footsteps. Every eye was on me. The whispers had done their work. Everyone knew something was happening, that this engagement party was about to become something else entirely. I climbed the steps and stood beside Daniel. He tried to take my hand, but his grip was uncertain. Questioning, Victoria handed me the microphone with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said she was sure I wanted to say a few words. I looked at the microphone in my hand. I looked at Daniel. I looked at Victoria, who thought she was still in control. I looked at the crowd full of people who could determine the Hartwell family's future. I said yes. I did want to say a few words. And then I began to speak. I said I wanted to thank Victoria for the warm welcome she'd extended to me. I said I wanted to thank the Hartwell family for showing me exactly who they were over the past few weeks. Victoria's smile flickered. I said when I came to this house, I made a decision. I said I decided to let the Hartwells see a simple version of me, a woman without expensive clothes or impressive credentials, a woman they might consider unsuitable. The crowd was absolutely silent. I said I wanted to see how they would treat someone they believed couldn't help them, someone they thought had nothing to offer, someone they considered, in Victoria's own words, common. Victoria's face went pale. I said what I found was illuminating. I described the dinner where I was compared unfavorably to my fiancé's ex-girlfriend. I described the whispered insults Victoria thought I couldn't hear. I described being called the help, being called common, being called a gold digger by people who knew nothing about me. Daniel was staring at me, his face a mask of horror. I said, and then I heard something I wasn't supposed to hear. I described the conversation in the study. I described Melissa and Victoria discussing how to get rid of me. I described discovering that I was just a placeholder, someone to keep Daniel busy while the family arranged his real future with Jennifer Henderson. The crowd gasped. I said I discovered that the Hartwell restaurants were in serious financial trouble. I said I learned they were desperate to merge with the Henderson family to survive the next fiscal year. I said I found out Daniel had been keeping his options open with Jennifer the entire time we were together. I pulled out my phone and showed a photo on the screen, Daniel and Jennifer at the restaurant, holding hands across the table. I said this was taken 2 weeks ago, while Daniel was supposedly working late. The crowd erupted in whispers. Daniel grabbed my arm. He said this wasn't what it looked like. He said he could explain. I said he already had explained. I said I'd given him the opportunity to be honest the night before, and he'd chosen to lie. I turned back to the crowd. I said there was more. The tent had gone completely silent again. Everyone in that crowd understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. The comfortable rules of social events had been suspended. The masks were coming off. I said I'd spent the past few weeks researching the Hartwell family business. I said I'd found some interesting things. I mentioned the financial records, the overextended credit, the declining sales, the supply contracts that were about to be terminated. Richard Hartwell's face had gone ashen. I said I'd also found evidence of something more serious. I looked directly at Melissa, who was standing near the back of the tent, frozen like a deer in headlights. I said Melissa Hartwell had been embezzling from the family business for years. I said the amounts had started small but grown over time. I said the total now amounted to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Melissa's husband turned to look at her with an expression of pure astonishment. Melissa screamed that it was a lie. She said I had no proof. She said I was just a bitter woman trying to destroy her family. Thomas stepped forward from the crowd. He said he had proof. He walked toward the stage carrying a folder that I knew contained years of documentation, bank records, expense reports, transaction histories, everything needed to demonstrate exactly what Melissa had done. He handed the folder to the supply company representative, who had approached the stage with the look of someone confirming their worst suspicions. Thomas said he'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. He said the Hartwells had cheated him in a business deal 15 years ago and he'd never forgotten. He said when Maya reached out to him with evidence of their current wrongdoing, he'd been happy to contribute what he knew. Victoria recovered her composure. She said this was outrageous. She said we had no right to make these accusations. She said she would sue us for defamation. I said she was welcome to try. I said everything I'd shared was documented and verifiable. I said the financial records were public information available to anyone who knew where to look. I said the evidence of Melissa's embezzlement had been compiled from sources that would hold up in any court. I looked at Daniel, who was still standing beside me, looking like a man whose world had just collapsed. I said there was one more thing. I reached up and removed the engagement ring from my finger. The cloudy diamond caught the light, revealing all its flaws. I said I would not be marrying Daniel Hartwell. I said I never intended to, not after discovering the truth about him and his family. I said the only reason I'd accepted his proposal was to give them enough rope to hang themselves. I handed the ring back to Daniel. I said he should give it to Jennifer. I said she was clearly who he actually wanted. Daniel's face crumpled. He said that wasn't true. He said he had feelings for me. He said the Jennifer thing was just business, something his mother had arranged. I said that was exactly the problem. I said he'd let his mother arrange his life, his relationships, his future. I said he'd never stood up for me when his family attacked me. I said he'd lied to my face about Jennifer even when I gave him the chance to be honest. I said a man who couldn't be honest with the woman he claimed to love wasn't a man I wanted to marry. The crowd was absolutely silent. I turned to face them one final time. I said I was Maya Chen. I said I was a CEO who had built a career through hard work and integrity. I said I earned more money in a month than most people earned in a year. And I said I lived simply because my grandmother had taught me that wealth was not the measure of a person's worth. I said the Hartwells had shown me their true character. They'd revealed themselves as people who judged others by bank accounts and social status. They'd treated me with contempt because they believed I had nothing to offer them. I said that kind of character would eventually destroy them, with or without my help. I set the microphone down on the podium and walked off the stage. The crowd parted like water. Behind me, I heard the chaos begin. I didn't look back as I walked through the tent, but I could hear all of it. Victoria's voice, sharp and desperate, trying to salvage the situation. She was saying there had been a misunderstanding, that I was clearly disturbed, that nothing I'd said was true. But the damage was done. I could hear the supply company representative speaking on the phone, his voice clipped and professional. I could hear other guests murmuring, some already heading toward the exits, wanting to distance themselves from the disaster unfolding before them. I reached the edge of the tent and paused. Melissa had cornered her husband near the bar, trying to explain, trying to justify. His expression was stony. He was looking at her like the woman he'd married had been replaced by a stranger wearing her face. Richard was slumped in a chair, his head in his hands. The patriarch of the Hartwell empire, brought down by the exposure of secrets he'd probably suspected but never wanted to acknowledge. And Daniel. Daniel was standing alone on the stage, the rejected ring still clutched in his hand. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Anger, hurt, regret. It didn't matter anymore. I walked out of the tent and into the cool night air. The stars were shining overhead, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath them. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with air that felt somehow cleaner, somehow lighter. Thomas found me by the fountain a few minutes later. He said it was done. He said the supply company had already called. The Hartwell restaurants would lose their major contracts by the end of the month. I asked if he felt satisfied. He said satisfaction wasn't quite the right word. He said it felt more like relief, like a debt finally paid. I understood what he meant. He asked what I would do now. I said I would go home. I said I would sleep well for the first time in weeks. I said I would wake up tomorrow and keep building the life I'd created for myself. A life that had nothing to do with Daniel Hartwell or his family. Thomas nodded. He said my grandmother would be proud of me tonight. I felt tears prick at my eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. I said I hoped so. He handed me a business card. He told me if I ever needed anything, to call. He said he owed me one. I tucked the card into my purse and thanked him. Then I walked to the valet station, collected my old Toyota from a very confused attendant, and drove away from the Hartwell estate for the last time. In my rearview mirror, I saw guests streaming out of the tent, the party dissolving into chaos. I saw Victoria gesturing desperately, still trying to control a narrative that had completely escaped her. I turned my eyes back to the road and didn't look back again. The drive home was quiet. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I just drove through the night, letting the miles put distance between me and everything that had happened. When I finally reached my modest apartment, I sat in my car for a long time before going inside. I thought about Daniel, about the man I thought he was and the man he turned out to be. I thought about how close I'd come to marrying him, to binding my life to his, to becoming part of a family that would have treated me with contempt forever. I thought about my grandmother and the lessons she'd taught me about character and worth. And I thought about the future, my future, the one I would build on my own terms with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could give them. I got out of the car and went inside. My apartment was small and simple, just the way I liked it. I made myself a cup of tea, took off the designer dress, and sat by the window in my old, comfortable robe. The city lights sparkled below me, thousands of lives unfolding in thousands of windows. I was just one of them. Nothing special, nothing extraordinary, and that was exactly how I wanted it. A week later, I was sitting at my kitchen table with my morning coffee when my phone buzzed with a news alert. The headline read, "Hartwell Restaurant Group faces closure following contract terminations." I read the article slowly, absorbing the details. The supply company had officially ended their partnership with Hartwell Restaurants, citing concerns about financial management and ethical practices. Without these contracts, the restaurants couldn't survive. The article mentioned that several former business partners had come forward with their own complaints about the Hartwell family's practices. It mentioned that an internal investigation had uncovered financial irregularities that authorities were reviewing. It mentioned that Melissa Hartwell had been asked to resign from her position in the company pending further investigation. It didn't mention me. I'd asked Thomas not to bring up my name, and he'd agreed. The story would be about the Hartwells' wrongdoing, not about the woman who'd exposed them. I didn't want fame or recognition. I just wanted the truth to come out. And it had. I finished my coffee and looked around at my small kitchen. The same kitchen I'd been sitting in a month ago when I first drove to the Hartwell estate to meet Daniel's family. The same kitchen where I'd made the decision to test them, to see who they really were beneath their polished surface. So much had changed since then, and so much had stayed the same. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Daniel. He said he needed to see me. He said he could explain everything. He said he'd made mistakes, but he still cared about me. He asked if we could meet for coffee, just to talk. I looked at the message for a long time. Then I deleted it without responding. Some doors, once closed, should stay closed. I stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the morning sun rising over the city. It was going to be a beautiful day. A day for new beginnings, for moving forward, for building something better. My grandmother's jade pendant hung at my throat, warm against my skin. I touched it gently, thinking about the woman who had taught me everything I knew about character and worth. She'd lived her life simply, not because she had to, but because she understood that the things that truly matter can't be bought. Love, integrity, self-respect, the certainty that you've acted according to your principles even when it would have been easier to compromise. The Hartwells had thought they could buy their way through life. They'd believed money and status made them better than others, entitled to treat people however they wanted without consequences. They'd been wrong. I turned away from the window and got ready for work. My ordinary job at my ordinary company, doing work I loved with people who respected me for my skills and character rather than my bank account. The Hartwell story would continue to unfold over the coming weeks and months. There would be investigations and legal proceedings. There would be consequences and repercussions. The empire they'd built on a foundation of arrogance and deception would slowly crumble. But that was their story now, not mine. My story was just beginning, and it would be written on my own terms, in my own words, according to my own values. That was the lesson my grandmother had taught me. That was the truth I'd carried with me through every moment of the past month. A person's worth isn't measured by their bank account or their social status or the opinions of people like Victoria Hartwell. It's measured by their character, by the choices they make when no one is watching, by how they treat people who can do nothing for them. The Hartwells had failed that test completely, and I had finally found the answer I was looking for. The answer was that I didn't need their approval. I didn't need Daniel's love. I didn't need anyone's validation to know my own worth. I already knew who I was, and that was enough.